We'll get started. My name is David Dylan Thomas. Welcome to Million Medicis, Funding the Content Revolution. So the hashtag for this, if you are prone to tweet as we go, is New Medicis. Like I said, my name is David Dylan Thomas. I'm a senior content strategist at EPAM. And you can reach me at movie_pundit. This is a core conversation, so discuss early and discuss often. The trick is we are, in fact, recording this, so the conversations that don't happen into a microphone are much, much harder to end up on the tape. So what we're going to try to do is pass around that lavalier. If you have something to say, we'll get it to you. Don't let that slow you down, but we'll just do our best. But this is going to be a lot of ideas that we're going to be throwing out, and they're not just here to be absorbed, they're here to be discussed, so feel free to jump in at any time. But what I'd like to begin with is by telling you a story. So back in 2011, there was a company called Redigi. And Redigi, the mission was very simple. If you had a song on your phone or on your computer that you didn't want anymore, you could go to Redigi and you could sell it. And while you were there, if you saw a song that you liked, you could buy it at a discount because it too was used. It was a used MP3 marketplace. Now, can anyone tell me exactly what happened next?
Lars Ulrich's head exploded.
Yes, they absolutely got sued. Capitol Records was the first into the fray, and they said, you guys are enabling illegal file sharing. It's really what they were complaining about. And Redigi said, well, allow me to retort. They said, look, the law that you're citing, that you think we're breaking, only applies to physical goods. But what we're selling are digital files. So this distribution right doesn't apply. But you know what? Even if these were physical things, guess what? There's something called the first sale doctrine. And the first sale doctrine says, if I buy something, I get to decide the price at which I resell it. So if it's digital, the law doesn't apply. And if it's physical, guess what? I still have the right to resell it. Now, how would you rule in this case? Anybody have any thoughts? Anyone else? So the judge said, no way. The judge says, look, it is beside the point that the original phonorecord no longer exists. It matters only that a new phonorecord has been created, which leads us to one inevitable question. What the hell is a phonorecord? So this is one of my favorite legal definitions of all time. Basically, this is from the United States Copyright Act of 1976. Yes, we're using a law from 1976 to decide about an MP3. And it says it is a material object into which sounds are fixed, right? It's this super mystical thing. It's like somehow the singer's voice has been fixed onto this magical device, right? But that's a phonorecord. So if you look back at the judge's original language, what he's saying is it is beside the point that the original phonorecord no longer exists. What does that mean? Well, when you sell something to Redigi, you promise, cross fingers, I will delete it from my iPhone and from my hard drive and everything else. The original phonorecord is gone. He said that doesn't matter. What matters is that a new phonorecord has been created because the second somebody goes onto Redigi and buys that MP3 and puts it on their phone, they've created a new phonorecord, and that's when you broke the law. So if you really want to resell your MP3, the judge said, I've got a solution for you. Can anybody guess?
Sell your MP3.
Absolutely. Wherever the phonorecord is, you can resell that. So you want my used MP3 of Blaze of Glory by John Bon Jovi? Okay, here you go. 30 cents, please. Right? So here's the thing, right? In a sense, the judge was absolutely right. Because the only really scarce thing in that entire case was the phonorecord. It was the iPhone. It was whatever that physical thing was. Because how we think about a thing is tied very closely. How we pay for it is tied very closely to how we think about it. So when something is desirable and scarce, right, it's expensive. It's one Hope diamond in the world. It's beautiful. It's definitely desirable. And it's scarce. There's only one of it. And it better be expensive. Something is desirable and common. Well, that should be cheap, right? Water. I definitely want it. But you know what? It's kind of everywhere. All right? So I shouldn't have to pay a lot for it. Desirable and infinitely replicable? Don't really know how to judge that, right? So it starts to bring up, how do we value content? And one of the ways we do that is we create artificial scarcity. We just pretend that something is scarce. We create an iTunes store, right, quote unquote store. And we pretend like it's a physical store, and that if I go in there and I pull down a copy of Jack Reacher, somehow there's one less of it in the world. Which is not at all true, but it's a useful fiction. And hey, artificial scarcity is great. I use the iTunes store all the time. But there's only one problem with it. It breaks really easily. Right? A record company wants you to think of that digital item, right, as a physical good until they don't. So when you're buying it from the iTunes store, absolutely, treat it like a physical good. Don't steal it. Remember all those ads about stealing MP3s? It was like, would you go into a record store and steal it? No, of course not. So don't steal MP3s. But the second I'm like, well, if I went to a record store and I bought a record and I wanted to resell it, I would resell it. Oh, not so fast. Let's not get crazy here. But I think there's a more fundamental question here, which I'd like to ask you. Is there any such thing as used MP3? Who said? Why not?
Because it's data. Data doesn't wear out, wears out.
Right. Anyone else have thoughts?
Well, one of these one-hit wonders that kind of is hot when it's hot and then it's completely not. One could claim that it doesn't have the value that it had before and it's used.
So the popularity of the thing might decline over time, and therefore the digital representation has actually raised or lowered in value. Any other thoughts?
Could you put security on it?
What's that?
Could you put security on it, and therefore, like, that restriction means that, like, if you're the only person with the keys to the thing, then all of a sudden you give away all the keys. Now, like, it's a little less scarce than it once was, and like, therefore, maybe used.
So the access to the thing could, in fact, change over time, and that would change the value.
It was sold in MP3 as a used MP3. So it's been sold, it's been used.
Explain what you mean by that.
I mean, that there's been a transaction around it. So it's been kind of processed as a transaction, and then that then used.
So the
As opposed to when it's sitting in the inventory in the
Right,
iTunes store,
right.
it hasn't been transacted upon. So if I can show that I've transacted with that,
Mhm.
then I've had some utility from that, and then that is a used digital file.
So the metadata around this particular digital item is tagged as used versus as sold,
Sold.
transacted
It's
upon
transacted upon.
versus not transacted upon, then constitutes use. Okay?
I'd say there is such a thing as a used MP3, but it's not, it shouldn't, I don't feel like it would be treated the same way we treat other used things, because things that are resold generally have wear and tear on them of some sort, and the more digital things get, the less that matters. But back in the past, used things were resold, and they would be distinctly lower quality than the new one.
So it's interesting you say that. Back in 2001, a group you may be familiar with asked the Copyright Office, hey, we'd like you to look into this whole digital goods thing. And the Copyright Office told Congress, okay, look, digital resale is a horrible, horrible, horrible idea, and here's why. The used copy is just as desirable and is in fact indistinguishable from the original, right? In the physical world, there is wear and tear, as you say, and they act as a natural brake on the effect of resales. That doesn't exist in used things. What they're basically saying is, look, when you drive a car off the lot, what happens? Right. When I download an MP3 from the iTunes store, what happens? Absolutely nothing. So in digital content, we suddenly lose the idea of an original and a copy. Right? We don't really have an economy for that. But what we do have is a way of thinking about it. So I'm going to borrow some work here from Michael Tomasello. He did a book called Why We Cooperate. And he talked about 3 kinds of sharing. And he explained it by talking about walking down the street and 3 different things happen to you. Now, first thing that happens is someone asks you for money, and you have a certain emotional reaction to that. Next, somebody asks you to help them cross the street. You get a different reaction to that. Finally, somebody asks you for directions, and you have a different reaction to that. Now, the person asking you for money, that's sharing of goods. That's a pretty big ask, right? Because when I give it to you, I no longer have it. Now, helping somebody cross the street, that's a sharing of a service, right? I'm going to keep all my stuff, but it's going to take me time, it's going to take me some effort. And in the first example, like if someone saw you refuse to give that person money, they might not judge you that harshly. Maybe a little more harshly if you say, I'm not going to help somebody cross the street. Now, helping with directions, that's sharing of information, right? And it makes me feel good. It doesn't feel like a big ask. It makes me feel good because I get to show off how well I know the neighborhood. And frankly, if somebody saw me refusing to give directions and I knew how to get to the place, they'd think I was kind of a douche. I mean, who doesn't share directions, right? So Clay Shirky took a look at these three kinds of sharing and he applied them to music and file sharing and sort of the great epidemic of Napster of the 90s, right? And all this sort of clutching of pearls around this idea that, oh, look at all these juvenile delinquents. They just want to steal stuff. That's why they're doing this. They like stealing. And he said, well, let's back up for a sec. If I wanted you to hear this really good album and I gave it to you, right? Well, I don't have that album anymore. That's a sharing of a good. If on the other hand, I make you a mixtape, and I mean a real mixtape, not just a Spotify playlist, right? Well, I get to keep all my music, right? It's a sharing of a service, but it's going to take me some time and effort to make the mixtape. I share a digital file. It's sharing of information. It costs me nothing. I get to keep all my stuff, and it's actually no effort. Back in the days of LimeWire and Kazaa, just flick a switch. You can browse, take anything you want. And sharing of information, well, what kind of a douche doesn't share information? So it wasn't this juvenile delinquent kind of I like to steal stuff place they were necessarily coming from. It was actually a very civic-minded kind of, well, that's what you do with information, right? And this is just information. And that's the problem. Content now is information. It doesn't just represent it or just contain it or just point to it. It is itself zeros and ones. It is information. So the question I put to you, how do we think about monetizing content in a way that respects that? And not just respects that. I'm going to give two challenges here. That also respects what we want to do. Because in each of those examples, what were we doing with content? We were sharing it. We have an urge to share it. We like sharing it. It's one of the things we really like to do with content. We like to hoard it and keep it to ourselves. And occasionally, we like to share it. And now the technology is much more leaning in that direction. So what are some ways we can think about monetizing content that kind of respect this fact? What are people's thoughts?
I would say, as far as music goes, you could argue that music isn't information. It's more of a artistic, piece of work. So, I mean, anybody can learn, how to get somewhere on a map, but not anyone could create a song.
True, that's true. Anybody else?
By facilitating the content and organizing it and thereby applying a service that adds value.
So that's interesting. You say the word service. Keep that in mind. But basically you're saying that the curation of that music, of that content, becomes a service in and of itself that has value above and beyond the fact that it's digital or whatever. It's something that you can't simply turn into zeros and ones.
Get paid every time it's shared. You can pay the creator every time it's shared.
Again, very interesting you say that, given what's coming up. But so the act of sharing then becomes a transaction. That's actually really interesting. I like that. Anyone else?
You can think about the impact, like if it's really timely information that I need right now, versus maybe 2 weeks later, it's not so urgent anymore, and maybe I don't need it as much, and maybe the price would be lower. But in that moment in which I need it, that impact could, the elasticity of my price curve could change.
So what you're saying is almost there's a notion in which time itself can become a way to value the content, that it's the immediacy, it has greater value, but as time goes on, going back to the used example, it actually starts to lose value.
Right, like there is an earthquake. Where is the earthquake?
Right.
2 weeks later, oh, the earthquake was, like, I'll pay to find out where the earthquake is right now. But if it was 2 weeks ago, I'm probably not going to pay to find out where the earthquake was. I can just take a little more time, maybe go to the USGS, look it up myself.
Right.
But like, if you know where the earthquake is right now, and it's happening right now, I gotta know.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mention that because it feels like when I'm looking for news information. The recent stuff is for free, and if I want to dig into the newspaper archives, I have to pay for it. Even though I shouldn't have to, because the information I'm looking for is the stuff people care about right now.
Yeah.
At that point, you're paying for the service. The service that they're providing is that data storage.
Yeah.
So I had a very similar conversation here at South by Southwest back in 2011, 2012. And it hinged on this notion, back to what you were saying before about service. What if we started thinking about content as a service? So here's where that conversation went. We were talking about Kickstarter, and we were talking about Joss Whedon, and this is before Joss Whedon had directed the third highest grossing film of all time. This is more like Buffy Firefly days. This is more like, he's still kind of a cult figure. And he had made a movie called Serenity, which was very popular, but not do very well. And so people loved it and they wanted more of it, but it was unlikely to happen. And we said, you know what? I bet if Joss Whedon decided to do a Kickstarter and he said, I'm gonna need $25 million to make Serenity 2, would he make that $25 million? Would that Kickstarter work? And around the table, we more or less said, okay, you know what? I think it would. It's a lot, but I bet if the rewards were there and everything was right, it would. And then we said, you know what? Let's make this a little more interesting. What if Joss Whedon said, I don't know what I'm gonna make next? It could be a comic book, it could be a movie, it could be a cave painting. I don't even know. But I do know it's gonna cost $2 million. He's got 30 days, he sets up all the rewards. Does he make it? What do people think?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Why?
Because people want him to make another movie.
Okay. Anyone else? So we decided, okay, let's make this even more interesting. What if there wasn't a product? What if it was just, I'm going to subscribe to Joss Whedon. I'm just going to send him 20 bucks a month or 5 bucks a month or whatever I think is appropriate to make sure that he's spending every waking moment doing what he loves rather than working at a Starbucks or making some movie he hates just so he can make enough money to do the movie he wants to make. I'm just going to keep sending him that money because my bet is if he's working on what he loves, it's going to be something that I love. So do people think that would work?
Word for Michelangelo. Speaking
Sounds like
That's it.
Patreon to me.
Yeah,
That's exactly
Amanda
what
Palmer.
Works for me.
Again, funny you say that. So we weren't the only ones who thought so. We're starting to see something, to your point about Michelangelo, crowdsourced patronage. We're starting to see experiments in, can I fund the artist directly, right? The one who is actually scarce in this equation as opposed to the content, which is ubiquitous at this point. Can I fund the artist? There's really only one Joss Whedon, and there are only so many hours in the day. He's the scarce thing. He's who I want to fund. So we're seeing patronism, which is focused on doing this for musicians. We're seeing subbable, which is super niche and focused on web series about science. That's mostly what this focuses on. But again, it's funding goes to the creator of the series. You're not paying for each individual episode. Subbable, S-U-B-B-A-B-L-E. Flatter, and by the way, this whole slide deck's going to be online, so you can get there. Flatter is sort of, going back to what you were saying earlier about monetizing shares, this monetizes likes. So Flatter basically turns the like button into a tip jar, which is interesting because I look at this more as tipping than as buying. Again, it's focused on the person, how much I appreciate their service, rather than the meal.
But are you, if you like more or if you share more, are you incentivized more financial?
So the way this works, I believe, is the like button, you basically have an account and you put like 20 bucks into it. And for the next month, you start, every time you hit like for that artist on a number of different social platforms, it's going to pull from that fund. Now, any sharing that happens, obviously, especially if it's sharing amongst people who are all using the service, is going to be better for the artist because if you like it and then you share it to someone else who has the same account and they like it, he's going to make more money. But it's not directly tied to the share. But I think that's a really interesting idea. I just came from a BuzzFeed session earlier, and essentially their shares are monetized. Like, that is their model. They want you to share the content. We have investing in talent. So you have PAVE, which actually allows you to invest in an artist early on. And depending on how their work does later, you can actually get then a cut of the proceeds of whatever art they sell later. What's that? It's called PAVE, P-A-V-E. And it's kind of a more traditional investment model, but again, the money is going to the artist. You're not paying directly for their content. This is starting to happen in journalism. Uncoverage has been evolving over the past few years, and it's basically funding of journalists, especially around particular topics. So if I really care about healthcare journalism, I can make sure there's a fund for that, or a fund for particular journalists who are covering that.
Which service is that?
It's called Uncoverage.
Question here. Do you think it's a danger if funders are actually big companies and then these certain journalists that would be more biased towards the company would bring big success in this?
So we're going to jump to this later, but let's talk about this now. So one of the things that we're starting to see coming out of these models are hybrid models, where you will see companies that kind of come in and supplement otherwise crowd-funded things. So I'll give you an example. Louis C.K. did Live at the Beacon Theater, and he did it all on his own. He shot it himself, he directed it himself, he sold it on his own site. HBO was not involved, there was none of that. And it was a hit, right? He sold it on his own site for only $5. Piracy suddenly went way down, and it went great. And he proved that he could put on a stand-up show on his own without any help. So what did he do the very next time he wanted to do a stand-up show? He just did it that way again, right? Absolutely not. He went with HBO. But here's the difference. At any moment, if HBO said, you can't use that joke, or it's got to be at this venue, or any of that, he could say, thanks, but no thanks. I got this. Because he'd already proven he didn't need them. HBO at that point had become icing on the cake. HBO could definitely give him a bigger audience, no question. But if he didn't like what they had to say, he actually had the power now in that relationship. So to that point, if a journalist, if an artist has established, and granted, this took Louis C.K. a very long time to establish, if they've established an audience such that they can count on them to say, hey, if I go do this on my own, are you guys going to be there to back me up? Then even if some big company comes in and says, hey, I want to fund your next piece, I want to fund your next thing, the artist still has the opportunity to say, well, okay, but if I say something bad about you, what are you going to do? And if they say, well, then we're not going to fund you, they can say, okay, well, these guys over here will. It's funny because this is super timely. I think it was 2 days ago, I don't know if anyone saw this, Alan Tudyk and Nathan Fillion, speaking of Firefly, these are two actors who are very popular in the Joss Whedon world, put out a crowdfunding campaign for a web series that they wanted to do. And in their video, they said, and I love this line, we have trust issues with the studios. Because they could go to a studio and say, hey, we want to do this web series, and they could probably get a deal, but the second that the studio suspected that, oh, not enough of an audience, oh, it wasn't a big hit coming out of the gate, they could pull the plug. Whereas if they decide we don't have trust issues with the audience, well, now all of a sudden it's a very different relationship. We'll get a little more into that later. But does anyone else have any thoughts about what those hybrid models, the risks or rewards of those kind of hybrid models? Like what happens when a big company suddenly wants to be one of your funders? Do people think they'd be comfortable with that?
I think there are some ethics involved. And whether it's, to take the journalist case, whether the journalist would even know who's backing him or her, or what a political group, a lobby group, a big corporate group could do is sway and sort of get somebody to do what they want them to do, sort of unknowingly. I don't know, I think there's some ethics here.
I think that the problem is probably the transparency towards the audience. Because you know, that it might happen that that journalist has a larger voice because of the funding, but it's not transparent that where the funding comes from. So as an audience, you won't be able to see where the funding is coming from and why this person's getting a big voice. This might be the general public funding that voice.
So I'm not 100% clear how it works on Uncoverage, but generally speaking, I've seen this on Kickstarter, I've seen this on Indiegogo, the funders are often revealed. You can often see who has funded and at what amounts. I don't know if that's 100% across the board, but that's generally what it is. But what gets more interesting to me about that scenario is the exertion of the control. So if I'm with a studio and I go to the studio and say, I want to make this movie, and they can tell me, okay, that's great, but you got to have this person and you got to have that person in it. We're actually having a negotiation before I get the money. If you go through a crowdfunding campaign, typically that negotiation happens up front. So I basically on my page say, this is what I'm going to do. Are you in or are you out? Like there's no negotiation. In some ways that's actually very undemocratic, but it is what it is. So if I give you that $1, or if I give you that $10, or if I give you that $100,000, I've given it to you in good faith that you're going to execute just on what you put on that paper. And any rewards you said you'd give me, that's what you're going to give me. And in fact, it's worse because if I do better than my goal, they have what are called stretch goals. So if I say I want to raise 100,000 and suddenly I've raised 400,000, I suddenly create new goals. And I've actually changed the contracts, right? There's all this new stuff you might not even realize was going to happen. So most of those platforms are swayed very heavily in favor of the artist. And again, it goes to that notion that I trust the artist enough to do the right thing. So it would be very, I won't say it's impossible, but I think it would be very difficult for any one of those funders, even if they gave a lot of money, to exert any influence after the fact because the money's already been given. There's nothing they can do. Now, I agree you would still want that transparency. I would want to know if Dow Chemical had contributed to that thing. But it would be tricky. It's trickier for them to exert any influence because they have no leverage at that point.
Well, I'm not sure about that because we have a very clear example of when money is influencing information is the research, medical research. There's all research around global warming and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a ton of money that is being poured into research to go against the concept of that scientific proving. So we know in research that there's a lot of lobby money that are changing. So saying that it's going to be difficult, I don't think so. And by the way, that's the reality of media too. Media have been founded by brands, and if they say something that brands don't want them to say, they stop the funding. It just happened a week ago.
Right.
So I forgot the name of the brand that decided to pull up all the money for which media they spend.
Right, and this is generally speaking why brands don't crowdfund. Because they know they don't have that leverage. They know that, especially if they're funding something they think is going to be successful, right? Like if I'm a brand and I want to fund a journalist, I'm going to fund a journalist who has a big following, right? I'm not going to fund a journalist who has no following. But if I do that, and they already have a big following, they don't need me. And so if they say something that I don't like, and I'm like, well, I don't like what you said, I'm going to pull my funding, the guy who wrote it's going to be like, okay, I still have all this other funding, see ya. So but that's why I think you see fewer brands trying to get into the crowdfunding game and staying in things that we haven't really seen. And it's funny, I was talking with someone earlier about this. We haven't seen as much experimentation with crowdfunding in science research, in part because the dollar figures are so much higher. However, we are starting to see much smaller experiments with that. Jen, do you remember the name of the science crowdfunding?
Experiment.org.
Experiment.org or .com. So. And what they're doing is like $10,000, right? We're not talking like major pharmaceutical, like we're nowhere near that. But because it's that small, very low donors, very small stakes, there's less of an opportunity for that kind of manipulation to happen. I just wanted to bring this one up. So Patreon, the one you guys were bringing up before. So this one's very interesting because it's a little bit of a hybrid model, right? It's not simply about I'm going to fund you and go do whatever you want. There's usually a bit more involved in terms of the amount of content that is actually going to create. And I'm going to pick on you right now. Mr. Jeff Ryder here has actually done one of these. I wanted to ask you about your experience with that.
I'm currently doing it.
I'm trying to do it. You want to grab the mic?
Dave waited till I was chewing gum to ask me. So what do you want? What's the
So tell me first of all, what's the setup like? Like, how do you actually get your money? What do you have to do?
Okay, so the way Patreon works is it leans towards the model of I'm funding an artist. I am Jeff Ryder, and I make comics. I write comics on the web, and I have to pay artists to draw these comics because I can't draw a stick figure. And that costs money. It's difficult to do. So I raise cash for people who want to read these stories. We created the first story for free and put it on the internet for everybody to read it to generate an audience for this content. And then there's more of the story. If you guys want to keep reading it, we need X amount of cash to do it. And you can contribute very much like Kickstarter, $1 or $2, and you get a thank you from me. More than that, you get various levels of return on your investment. But regardless of what you contribute, each time new content comes out and gets posted, as I release what I have termed to be paid content, then I get money from you. So you agree to contribute $5, $10, $100 per whatever it is I've determined is my content that I'm going to give out, whether it's a song or an album, or in my case, a new chapter of the story online. And when I have it ready to go, I push it to you, you get it in your inbox, and then your credit card gets charged and I get money from you. So in a sense, it's money after the fact. I've made the content and I'm going to get money from it, as opposed to I need the money so that I can make the content. Unlike Kickstarter and some of the other ones, I don't have to reach certain goals to achieve the money. For example, on Kickstarter, if you don't make your $50,000 goal, you get nothing. Whereas on Patreon, for example, the thing that we're running right now runs about $1,200 per chapter. But if I get it ready to go and I want to put it out there and I've only raised $900, I can take the $9, give you the content, and essentially I'm eating the other $300 out of my own pocket. But I don't lose the contributions of people who want to give money for my content. With Patreon along the way, there's, similar to Kickstarter and the other things, there are ways I can share limited versions of the content in advance to tease what you're going to get eventually before the paid object or comic or song or whatever comes down the pipe. So there's a lot of community building involved in that.
And as an artist, how are you liking it? I know it's early days, but how are you liking it so far?
It's valuable for me right now because the particular community that I create art in uses Patreon a lot. There are lots of webcomic, specifically creators, and it's mostly more of the types of comics you would associate with comic strips in the newspaper than superheroes punching each other. But there's a strong community around that who understand that Patreon's a good way to fund that stuff. So there are lots of those people who look through Patreon for things that are interesting for them. But it's not as well known as something like Kickstarter, so there's not a wide variety of, there are people who just shop on Kickstarter. They wander in there to find interesting things to back. Mm-hmm. I have to limit my wife's Kickstarter spending or we're going to be broke. And we get weird things in the mail all the time, and I don't know where this came from, but this is interesting. I think that particular site doesn't do a good job of, when I'm looking at one piece of content, feeding me, oh, look, there's all sorts of other similar content that I might almost also be interested in, which creates less movement around the site and inside the marketplace of patronage itself. Yeah. So it's, with our experience so far, it's very word of mouth. It's a lot of friends and family, and then it's a lot of people who are already in the industry who knew who we were, who were looking for our project, as opposed to Kickstarter and some of the other ones do a better job of helping you put your content forward to people who don't know who you are and don't know what your project is. So that's definitely a drawback of Patreon so far.
Yeah, and I've found that content recommendation engines in crowdfunding in general are not quite at Amazon levels yet, so I think that's an ongoing thing.
I think Kickstarter's the only one that does that well so far.
Yeah. So back at 2013, I think, Steven Soderbergh was at the San Francisco International Film Festival, and he gave this great speech. I highly recommend you seek it out, where he was talking about it's about horses, not races. And what he meant was that right now Hollywood is super, super focused on the opening weekend. They're focused on the horse race. How well did this movie do in this one instance, in this one opening weekend? Was it great? Wonderful. Was it terrible? It's the end of the world, and we're done with you. Whereas he says, look, if I had a movie studio, I would just pick like the 5 best directors I could find and just keep feeding them money, knowing that some of their hits would be big enough hits that I would be able to keep going, but they would continue to grow as an artist and get better and better and better. Because the horses are actually where the game is. So as we think about this, I want you to sort of ask yourself, like, are there people you would subscribe to? Are there actually people you could imagine yourself subscribing to?
Already did.
Oh, who did you subscribe to?
Peter Case was one musician, and it's interesting the quote about the film with the horses and the races makes me think about, early artist development in the music industry, where you had an A&R guy who actually was doing artist development, and it wasn't about having a hit album first time out. Might take 3 or 4, but they were actually developing the artist. And a lot of those people now, they don't have any backing. So there are people, much like the case you were saying with Joss Whedon, where, whatever they create, I just want them to keep creating, it'll be interesting, and so I'll fund that.
Yeah, and this became a problem in the music industry and the film industry as studios were bought up by corporations, because the studios didn't necessarily have quarterly deadlines or shareholders in that sense to satisfy, whereas the second they were bought by larger corporations, they were starting to get asked questions they were never asked before, which is, what have you done for me lately? What have you done for me this quarter? Which, if you're trying to nurture an artist over a long period of time, is not an easy question to answer. So one of the problems we run into is discovering new talent, right? Because some of these examples we're talking about where there's a very direct relationship between the artist and the audience, they already had big audiences. Kevin Smith, Trent Reznor, Louis C.K., they had big audiences to begin with, and they got those audiences the traditional way. So it's kind of unfair, right? How can you expect me to suddenly be able to play at that level? But it gets a little more interesting than that. Does anybody know who this is? Okay. How about now? This guy is named Spoken Reasons, and he's right here in a movie called The Heat with Sandra Bullock and Melissa McCarthy. Now, Sandra Bullock and Melissa McCarthy got into this movie the old-fashioned way. Spoken Reasons, he didn't have an IMDb credit to his name before he was in this. Spoken Reasons is a comedian, and he couldn't really get into any clubs, so he started putting his comedy on YouTube. And over the course of about 5 years of doing this, he built up an audience of about 1 million followers, 1 million subscribers. Those 1 million subscribers put him on the radar of YouTube, who's gotten into the, were you looking for Spoken Reasons? It got him on the radar of YouTube, who's gotten into the talent acquisition business. And that then put him on the radar of the director of this film. Now, here's the interesting thing. Let's have some fun with math. He's got 1 million subscribers on YouTube. Let's say 5% of them said, I will give you $1 a month. You make $600,000 a month, or a year, before taxes. So he doesn't need Hollywood. I can guarantee you he did not make $600,000 starring in The Heat. Hollywood needs him. So now the other question to ask yourself is, who would subscribe to you? Can you think of anyone? Anyone who would say, I will give you $1 a month. It's funny, I've talked to people about this, and the first thing they kind of bring up, okay, you would, yeah, that's good. And a lot of people are like, their mom or their dad, and I'm like, you know what? I quit my job for a year to make a movie, and my mother basically supported me that whole time. Our parents have been subscribing to us for a very long time, it turns out. They just may not be always happy with the content. One thing I want to point out about this ecosystem that I think is interesting we should talk about is what happens when you distribute risk. I think this is at the core of a lot of what we're talking about. Right now, the typical model is all of the risk in any artistic project, any big artistic project is centralized, right? Usually inside of a producer or a distributor. And as a result, they maintain a lot of control. And frankly, I don't blame them, right? If I put up $200 million for your thing, you can bet I'm going to control a lot about that thing. I just gave you $200 million, right? So yeah, I'm going to keep Final Cut. The director's not going to keep that. The gatekeeping, deciding who's going to be a star, who's not going to be a star. Yeah, it's my money. I'm going to decide whether or not I think you're ready to be a star. And then on the audience side, yeah, I'm going to decide how much you pay for this thing once it's released. And DRM, yeah, you can bet I'm going to slap DRM on that thing. I just paid $200 million to produce all these copies. Think I'm going to let you download it for free? Are you insane? Yes, I'm going to sue you for putting Mickey Mouse on that face cake. True story. But a really interesting thing happens when you distribute that risk, right? Now all of a sudden, instead of a studio, you have a platform. You have an environment in which the audience can negotiate terms and say, for this much money, you get this much, and this is what I'm trying to do. Now the risk is distributed among 1 million Medicis, right? Instead of 4 or 5 family members with a lot of cash and a lot of obsessions deciding who gets to keep making art, we're going to say, no, there's going to be 1 million of them. And here's what's going to happen. All of a sudden, the artist gets to keep Final Cut because the artist told you up front, this is what I'm going to do. Are you in or are you out? And the artist also gets to make choices about the copyright. Do I want to use Creative Commons? Loosen this up a little bit? I'm free to do that because I've lost the financial risk. I've already made the money I need to do this. In fact, if I want to, I can collaborate with the audience. You guys can be artists too. Now, if I'm one guy giving you $200 million, just no way I'm going to let the audience be part of the project. I didn't hire them. But if I've already made my money and I'm interested in collaborating, I can do it with much lower risk. Now, from the audience's perspective, the audience actually gets to decide what the price is, right? Literally on Kickstarter, right? I can contribute at $1, I can contribute at 20, I can contribute at 1,000. It's totally up to me. In fact, if you look at Radiohead, In Rainbows, is an album they released a few years ago. And when they released it, it's just a really clunky old website with a little box, and you put in, this is how much I'm going to pay for it. So of course, everybody just put in 0, right? No. Average price was $5. I mean, some people were contributing 10, 20, some people were contributing nothing or 1 or 2, but average, people gave $5. Why? Because crowdfunding really is about passion. What am I passionate about? What do I care about? It goes back to the tip jar. I love what you're doing. I love you. The product, I can buy in a CD anywhere, but I really want to be a part of this. And then the gatekeeping. The audience gets to take control of that too, right? No studio head pointed at Spoken Reasons and said, you're the one. No, over 5 years, 1 million people eventually reached the conclusion, yes, he's the one. So the audience gets to make that decision now. So any thoughts, reactions, concerns? I'm curious, like, what does this spark anything in anybody's mind?
Well, I would say that in addition to that, now the distribution of the content, they don't have the monopoly anymore. Before, the media company were owning the distribution vehicle. Now it's gone.
Yeah.
For example, with the rise of OTT for television and stuff like that, it's like for a few $1,000, you put your channel on TV.
Yeah.
The living room of people.
I mean, this is something that's even impacting, I'm glad you brought that up, because each one of these I'm pointing at, some of them are also distribution platforms, right? and YouTube's no dummy. They've already started rolling out for some of their creators, you can find this now online, basically little tip jars, little crowdfunding buttons on their videos. Like, they don't want that money going to Kickstarter. They want that themselves. But no, and that's a really interesting point. So I was talking to somebody from HBO like years ago, just kind of chatting about stuff. And it was really funny too, because you could tell they were in a position where they couldn't really just say everything that was going on, because every other word was prefaced by, well, what I can tell you is. So so we were talking about, over the top, we were talking about this idea of, HBO Go had already been launched, and it was very successful, but it was clearly you had to have a cable subscription. And HBO was looking at leaving hundreds of billions, with a B, dollars on the table if they decided to really piss off Comcast or Verizon or any of these guys by just offering HBO Go as a standalone. But what he could tell me was, in places where there was no Comcast, where there was no Verizon, they were experimenting with it, and they were experimenting with price points, and it sounds like they eventually got to one, right? So even large corporations are starting to take the lesson of, you know what, maybe it's better if instead of one big giant thing that's going to feed everybody, we kind of just sprinkle it out. So this is not a panacea. I stress that this idea that we are experimenting with now will not work for all things. In general, if anyone tells you I've got the solution for X in the future that we're heading into, they're wrong. It's going to be a future of lots of different solutions that will work in lots of different cases. So, see this mansion here? Yeah, you're not going to get that. Crowdsourced patronage is not going to help you buy the Lakers. Not going to happen. But what it can do, at least for some artists, is let you do your next thing. And 90% of the artists that I talk to, that's what they care about. They don't care about being Kanye. They don't care about the fame and the fortune. They want to do the work, and they want to be able to feed their family. Like, you let me do those two things, I am happy as a clam. It's a creative middle class, right? And something that we're generally trying to get more of, right? And in general, so I'm curious, how many people in this room are creators, are artists, would define themselves either as by hobby or profession, I like to make stuff? Okay. Would you be satisfied if I told you, okay, you're never going to be a millionaire, you're just going to have this, but you get to keep making art? That's good enough for you? Okay. Here's the other end of that, the type of art you get to create. Guess what costs $7 million? No, really, guess. What artistic thing, what work of art, what work of pop culture? You're absolutely right. Which one? Dude, did you look at my presentation beforehand? Absolutely. Every single episode of Game of Thrones cost $7 million. And actually, I made this slide a little while ago. It's probably more But yeah, so as much as I would like to be wrong, I don't think we're going to be able to crowdfund the Game of Thrones at this point. But again, I ask you, how many of you are, what are your artistic aspirations? Are they at this level? What are the kind of things you want to create? Anyone?
I've been making podcasts for 10 years now, done about 500 episodes, and the overhead is so minimal. Like, I drive to where the interviews are, and like, I already have the recorder, I already have the software, SoundCloud, I have my account, like, so other than like gas and parking, it's super sustainable unless our internet crashes in this country. So it's kind of nice. I don't have a like, oh man, I really need to keep getting X amount of dollars, else I have to stop this. You know?
And if you don't mind me asking, are you able to do this for a living, or do you have to?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. I have a couple jobs, so I just like working. I have like 4 jobs.
Mhm.
It's because I love being busy.
Sure.
But it's definitely like a paid component. It's not just a like, oh, when I have time, I do this.
Yeah, that's great.
I don't know if you're familiar with Teacher, Pay Teachers. It's a platform for teachers to buy or sell their lesson plan.
Oh, really?
What's it called?
Teachers, Pay Teachers. So I discovered this platform because I was working for a company that now they are making $100 million in revenue in 4 years. The top teacher is making $2.5 million in revenue.
When's the last time you heard? When's the last time you heard a teacher is making 2.5 million? Yeah. So I take it back. You can be a millionaire. You can buy the Lakers. That's fantastic. Anybody else?
Just that we're here to introduce tomorrow a new platform. We are ShareRite, and it's about sharing what you create and giving you control over how your content gets used.
Excellent.
So I'll take that chance.
Yeah. Well, no, say a few words about it. Tell me a little more.
Yeah, well, the whole concept of ShareRite is for teachers, lessons plans, podcasts, musicians, artists, to give them the control over, do they want it copyrighted? Do they want to release under Creative Commons? Do they want to include advertising? Do they want to provide free downloads or paid downloads or no downloads?
Yeah.
That's the concept.
Awesome. Just keep track of time. So we were talking before about the hybrid approach. So we've talked a little bit about this already, so I'll kind of skip ahead. But Seth Godin has been self-publishing for a very long time now. A publisher approaches him and says, look, if you can raise $40,000 on Kickstarter, we will put your book in stores. It's Seth Godin, so instead he raises $287,000, but you get the point. Now here's the thing. That deal was way better for the publisher than it was for Seth Godin because the publisher eliminated the risk, right? They got Seth Godin to go out and basically do the market research for them to know, yes, it's a worthy investment. We talked about Louis C.K. This is one of my favorites. So don't know if you know this, but record companies make way more money off of the illegal videos of their songs on YouTube than they do off of the legal versions of those songs. So sometimes that collaboration happens without your knowledge. Here's why. Fairly recently, YouTube instituted a policy where if your copyrighted work ended up on the web, right, and you didn't authorize it, they give you 2 choices. You can pull it down, or you can say, hey, YouTube, why don't you send me all the data that you're getting off of that, and while you're at it, why don't you slap an ad in front of that video, and why don't you send me the money? Guess what the record companies decided to do? So sometimes that collaboration happens without you even knowing it. And then you have just sort of the outright Disney buying Maker Studios, right? This ground-up YouTube channel for $5 million. What this comes back to is a very, very old concept, right? We're talking about sort of this post-ownership economy, right? And like digital goods and getting past these physical things. The physical things part is actually the part that's new. If you go far enough back, if you wanted to hear a song, you had to go find the person and have them play the song. That's it. Or you could learn it, and if you were rich enough to own an instrument, play it at home. Those are your options. Go a little further back, if I want to hear a story, I have to go to Thax Cave and hear the story. That's it. Can't download the audiobook. No, I got to go find Thack. So this whole notion of creating phonorecords is relatively new. At some point, we learned how to fix that story onto something. And I will argue that we took away the wrong lesson from that, because instead of making it easier to distribute content, we actually made it harder. Now, it wasn't the worst thing in the world to do, because we monetized it, right? We actually made some money that way. And a lot of great art was created that way. But a lot of great art wasn't created. And a lot of people made a lot of money, but a lot of people didn't make money, mostly artists. So what I love about the Redigi case is that it forces us to ask a very, very, very simple question. What is a song? What do people think a song is? If you had to give me a definition. Anyone? Is it a MP3? Is that a song? No? How about a piece of sheet music? Okay. How about sorry, what?
A song is art. A song is the experience of the song.
A song is the experience.
Which is how all art works. The artist can only ask for your attention during the time that he's at. Can only hope to have your attention during the time that he's asking for it. So a song is my 2.5 to 3 minute experience of that song, whether I listen to it one time or 1,400 times, whether I see it live or listen to it on my laptop. It's whether that song speaks to me and makes me happy or sad or whatever it's intended to do. It's the artist's. The song is the artist's ask for my attention and brain.
So
I think copyright, I can't remember for sure, but I think Copyright Office defines it as the performance of a work. Something like that.
Yeah. Which is interesting because that notion of performance brings it back almost to the experience, right? Because the performance is kind of ineffable, right? It happens in that moment and you experience it, and that's, yeah. So I think that's true. I think that the sheet music points to the song. I think that the MP3 is a very high fidelity representation of the song, but the song is the song, it's an experience. And what we've done for a very long time now is worry about how to make money off of those pointers. But I think we'll have a better go of it if we start instead to think more about, well, why is money important to that ecosystem in the first place? And I would argue that that's so that we can continue making art. But I welcome us to question that. So we still have about 10-ish minutes to sort of discuss the ideas that I've thrown at you for the past 40 minutes. So what are people's thoughts?
Yeah, as far as the value of content broadly, we're talking about, you use the word journalist, for instance, and a journalist establishing a crowdfunding campaign and whatnot. I don't know how you would define a journalist or how you would define a singer, just like how you would define a song. So I guess, is there any process or even automated process that would actually use some kind of data to establish the value at any certain point, or establish you as an artist or as a journalist, other than just calling yourself a journalist?
So
I was thinking, sorry.
Sure, yeah.
I was thinking of breaking down, like there's credentials, there's clout or influence, there's credibility. So you could say this, you could even have people rank you by credibility, like if they think you're credible, something like that. And then there would be potential sentiment, and maybe even a bit like artistic value or something like that.
So I'm going to answer your question with a woofie. So there's this notion in Cory Doctorow's, I think he originated in Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom. Anyone sure? Anyway, in the future, people will have value assigned to them, and it's going to be called a woofie. And it's basically like digital karma, right? And if you go out and you're a good person, you do good things, and people like what you do, they will just simply send you woofie, right? And you'll accumulate it in a bank account, and it'll get you into stores, it'll buy you stuff, and it'll walk around you like a digital presence, right? WHUFFIE, you can kind of look that up. And if you don't have it, people will shun you, you won't be able to buy things, like it'll just sort of be this, terrible existence for you. And what I think we're starting to see, and this is part of the reason Cory Doctorow wrote it this way in the first place, because he saw it coming, is we're shifting very much toward a notion of woofie. That's actually how we're going to do things. We still have accreditation, for example, but it's getting increasingly difficult to make that work. There's a decades-old thing around developers and saying, okay, well, can anyone just call themselves a web developer? Should we have something that they can say that, like, no, point to this thing that says, okay, this body says that I'm a developer? But because the web is flat and accreditation is hierarchical, it's really, really difficult to get momentum on any of those things. On the other hand, if I can say, oh, no, I'm a developer, no, ask anyone. Ask these 50,000 people on my page. Or if, am I authorized to sell this thing? Oh, look at my eBay page. Look at my eBay rating. Like the eBay rating, the crowd telling you, oh, I'm good, is starting to replace that in a lot of these fields where it's really very difficult to get accreditation. The other problem is, I'm a content strategist. How long has that term been around, right? Is there a content strategy academy where I can prove to you, yes, I'm a content strategist. Here, I got my certificate from the Content Strategy Academy. No, we keep inventing so many new professions, we can't keep up with that.
So if a client of yours, and I'm not sure how you make your money, but if a client were to say, how do I hide my
Oh, we look at results, right? So you look at results, right? I can say, well, I did this work with this one client and it boosted their sales by 200%. And I did this and I did this and I did this. And those are things that a content strategist does. And I can do that for you too. All of a sudden, what really matters is, can I get the job done? Not, is my title a real title?
Well, not your hourly rate, just a piece of content. How would you value a single piece?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, that gets way more complicated, right? Because you have to say, well, to whom? Because context suddenly becomes crucial, right? To his point earlier, a piece of content of the earthquake happened in Haiti. That's a piece of content. And it's extremely valuable the day the earthquake happens in Haiti. It is not so valuable 5 years later. So that is a really super malleable thing that the first place I'd look to answer that is context.
So it's valuable for an audience, because that's the challenge of content. I mean, specifically news content, there's no intrinsic value. There's a music value. So if you care about Haiti, it's valuable.
Yep.
If you don't,
Yeah. Well, audience is more context, right? Not only when, but also for what audience.
but where there's a piece of answer here is what's happening in artificial intelligence and the development of deep learning algorithm. So basically it's an algorithm that is built with layers that are learning from each other. And so it happened that the value is going to be calculated based on your profile. So I am Jeff, I value Heidi. Suddenly the algorithm is going to say, okay, let's put this information in front of the eyes of Jeff because he values Heidi. It's weird.
Yeah, and that's,
Deep
yeah.
learning is a really, really interesting field for customizing the value by customer, as opposed to trying to develop a value that would be the same for everybody.
Yeah, and that's another dimension of that, right? Is personalization, right? What its value to me is way different than its value to you, which kind of brings us back to crowdfunding platforms, right? That's the reason you have lots of different levels that you can participate in. One of the big misconceptions about crowdfunding is that, oh, if I need to raise $1 million, then I need to find 1 million people who are going to give me $1. No, that's not how it works at all. What actually is going to happen is you will see what's called a power law distribution. A power law distribution looks like this, right? If this is just a few people, yeah, hockey stick, right? You will have a very few people who will give you a lot of money, and then it'll be a hockey stick all the way down. This many people will give you more, a little, and then you have a lot of people who will give you just a little bit of money. And what's interesting about that is you look back at that spoken reasons example I gave you where, okay, let's have 5% of the people give them $1. Here's the thing. 5% are not going to give them $1. 0.1% are going to give them $100 a month. And then, a few less are going to give, or a few more are going to give him, $200 or $20 a month and so on and so on. He's not going to actually have to worry about getting to 5%. He actually only has to get to about 2% before he makes that $600,000. Like, that's the beauty of crowdfunding, is that you don't actually have to have this flat math where suddenly I have to find 1 million people. No. I just have to find just the right amount of people and just the right distribution of people. Any other questions, thoughts?
And just to, maybe this is wandering away from the point, but to the gentleman who was talking about accreditation and how do you verify that the people within a crowdfunding system are who they say they are or can do what they say they can do. Some of the reasons I think crowdfunding is successful and popular is that it intentionally eliminates those things because those types of things can marginalize people. Why do I have to be accredited from the Magical Academy of Content Strategy or whatever? If I can do it, I can do it. And if I can't afford to pay $500 to go to the academy of whatever, then I'm never going to get my chance to get out in the world and do this, even though I really can and am good enough to do it. And watch, I can prove to you that I'm good enough to do it.
I mean, yeah, what you're talking about is reputation. And we're getting back to a very tribal way of valuing each other's contributions to society, right? It's sort of like, okay, I need new shoes. Well, Bob's the guy who does shoes. Oh, okay. Like, how do I know that? Well, because look at everyone's shoes. Like, that's how I know. And all we've done is kind of take that and just made it global, right? And said, okay, well, I can represent that on a website, and even if you're in China, you want shoes? Yeah, you want to go to Bob. Anyone else?
So things can now for scope reasons, like blended whole roles.
That's a good question. I have not. I should go look that up. Yeah, I mean, I know he still has a huge following on YouTube. And frankly, that is kind of the way these things tend to go, right? Like, and we're still working out that barrier between I am internet famous and I am super famous. And what's interesting to me about this is it points to a future where you never have to be more than internet famous to make a living and do what you love, right? If you ever go further than that, that's kind of icing on the cake. And frankly, even if you do, the odds are you're gonna probably kind of drift back down. I mean, really funny story. You guys familiar with Key and Peele? Okay, so Key and Peele rose this comedy team on Comedy Central, for those of you who don't know. Hilarious. They do a lot of releasing their stuff online, tons of it. And they will run into fans all the time who are like, oh yeah, you guys make great internet videos. Like, they have no idea that they have a Comedy Central show. No clue. They just think that this is the thing. The top 7 or so celebrities that age 18 through 30, they did the sample, age 18 through 30, and they took the top 20 YouTube stars and the top 20 Q rating, for those of you who remember traditional star rating systems, stars, so like real stars, jumbled them all into a list and had people ages 18 to 30 rank them, right? Rankings turned out the top 5 were all YouTube stars, right? Then came Paul Walker, who sadly is no longer with us. Then came another YouTube star. Then came Jennifer Lawrence. So the highest living celebrity on that list is at number 8, and it's Jennifer Lawrence, right? So we're increasingly moving to this notion of what's Hollywood? Like, what's, you know, what is this Hollywood you speak of? Where really, you really don't ever have to go any higher than internet famous. Internet famous, basically, you can start dropping the internet. Just lose it. It doesn't matter anymore. Oh.
I'm just curious what you think. I mean, I see artists, people who are so beloved, internet famous people, but when you look at news and journalism, and you know, now we have such a hard time paying for any of that. You know, like we all expect to get it for free. Do you feel like there's a solution for funding journalism?
So I have yet to see what are the net results of uncoverage right now. I think that journalism is going to be the bellwether for most content because it is the hardest sell, right? If I'm talking about music, people are always going to love music. Always going to be easier to kind of move that. Journalism is very much in that almost government service thing of nobody really wants to pay for it, but we really, really need it. It's sort of like trying to get people to pay for infrastructure, right? Like, we're gonna die without it, but nobody wants to pay for it. I would love to kickstart, you know, infrastructure. I'd be really curious to see if that broke crowdfunding. Sorry, guys.
Well, I would just add to that. I think one of the things that makes it difficult for journalism, and I say this because I was a broadcast person and radio person who ended up working in tech because of difficulties in journalism, but is that people don't necessarily see it as a creative venture. It's not where everything else that we've been sort of citing as examples, film, music, comics, art, painting, it's a creative expression. And really, really good journalists, well, the writing could be amazingly stellar and really creative, but they actually have to take that sort of unbiased approach, and they can't really do their own outland creative expression. So it becomes a little bit more ubiquitous. People just expect it to be there.
Yeah, and you bring up a really interesting conflict too, right? Because part of what makes crowdfunding work is personality. Like, I am funding you. I love you. I don't really care. The content is almost secondary at that point. Problem with journalism is if it's good journalism, you disappear,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
So how do we get around that? Now, there's a couple things happening. One is we're starting to be less picky about that, frankly. Like, we're starting to say, hey, I love Ta-Nehisi Coates. I would crowdfund Ta-Nehisi Coates. But he's definitely got a point of view. He's definitely got a personality. But if he said he wanted to do, even though he's usually doing columnist stuff, he said he wanted to do investigative journalism, I'd be like, go for it. On my little screensaver, I've got John Oliver. I would crowdfund John Oliver in a second. He's doing some of the best investigative journalism right now. So I think part of it is we're just going to get over we're going to know that we're smart enough generally to get when it's John Oliver talking and when it's the facts talking. Like, we've kind of proven through The Daily Show and Colbert Report and all that stuff, most people get what's actually true and what's actually personality in all of those ventures. So that's one thing. But at the same time, I don't think we've got the answer yet for journalism. I think we're starting to get there a bit because some of these journalism platforms are actually focused more on, I care about this topic and I want to go to that fund for that topic, and now you're taking the personality out of it. I think that gets us part of the way there, but I don't think we've figured that out yet. I think when we do, like in digital design or whatever, we call that an edge case, or user experience design, we call that an edge case. Like, if you can solve journalism content, you can solve all content, because that to me is the hardest, with the possible exception of healthcare, but yeah. Okay, I think we're over our time. I'm going to hang out though, because I love this discussion. If you want to, oh, thank you.